ZeusCloud, right? ZeusCloud essentially uses a role um, as shown here through IAM, with the role being security audit with those permissions, right? And this goes through how you essentially can set this up in your own environment, right? If you're trying to understand cloud security, but also kind of how these systems work, right? This is a free open source tool, fairly new, okay? And I definitely wanted to cover this because as far as open source goes, this is essentially one of the areas that a lot of people are trying to figure out, okay, what should my enterprise adopt? And I think this is a really good addition to AWS security, right? So to get started, essentially, you can clone this repo locally. You'll do a cd command into the directory when you're ready to make deploy. But first, let's get into some details. So the way this works is you'll create a role, right? The role will essentially have a Amazon resource name or ARN, right? That ARN we're going to input from the template, right? I definitely will drop the documentation in the video. But for simplicity's sake, just want to give you a high-level architecture view, right? So essentially this role here will have this assigned permissions. We're going to update the file so the file knows exactly what's our default profile, what are the permissions, so it can essentially make connections back to that API, right, and grab some data. And then we'll present what that data looks like in the next video, right? So just wanted to quickly kind of go over the concept for today. We're essentially going to show you what cloud security looks like. Again, if you're doing this locally, make sure you're not exposing any credentials to the open internet, right? Localhost, as far as that's concerned, if you're doing this through a virtual machine, that option's covered in the documentation as well. Okay, so essentially what we are looking at here is our connected account, right? So as we can see, we essentially have our connected account here. Now you can go to add new account. So essentially, if you wanted to add a new account, right, for this, I already populated this. If we were doing a user access key, you would enter these details here along with the secret access key and then that region, right, associated with that. So I ran a scan, so let's take a look at, some of the outputs of this, right? Again, you can see here I'm running on localhost, right? And I have a nice little logo up here. So we have a couple checks right now. Mind you, this is a pretty bare bones AWS account. I rarely do use AWS outside of some labs and things of that nature. I'll be showing some more demos across this as well. So let's click on the CIS, right? So we can see essentially the rules that are passing. If you can see here, we'll scroll down and I'll make this a little larger so it's clear. So maintain current contact details, right? Resources passing. Let's go to one of one. So it did pick up some no root accounts should exist, right? And then if they did exist, this essentially would show that ensured MFA is enabled. MFA is enabled, right? If it wasn't, this essentially would populate that. So some really good visibility from some compliance control mechanisms, right? As you can see, this is more tailored to the services associated with AWS, right? In the future, it's likely this will cover Azure, Google Cloud as well. This is fairly new, right? So let's go back up and take another look. PCI DSS is a large one as well, right? Again, you do have different multiple versions, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, right? But let's check out PCI. So we can see a little bit more context, right? Specifically, you have these broad set of controls with PCI, right? Now, again, to map that back to cloud environments, essentially there goes more technical depth, if you will. What exactly is that enforcement, right? Outside of that vague statement. So you should see some familiar areas. MFA should be enabled for the root account, right? EC2 instances shouldn't have public IPs to prevent exposure, right? This also does have attack paths. I didn't have anything that popped up, but should you want to know what attack paths are, we can break that down in another video as well. But as you can see, there's quite a lot of out of the box that can run a scan, right? So, and I'll show you what essentially happens when you do run a scan. It will give you a nice little UI showing you what's the progress, right? And this will break down anything that is going across your environment. Now, mind you, it's really good to have, 0 resources passing. I don't have any resources in here specifically, right? But it definitely allows us to go a little bit further, right? So if you can see, I can measure my risk. And the risk is essentially data access, patching issues, port backup. We have severity, we have account, and then we can also look at the alerts if they're muted, unmuted, and then essentially we're looking for fail, right? So when we're looking at attack paths, this will also show you if any of those rules ever violated in that sense, how those can be exposed, right? And essentially what's the severity of it. So that's really the concept of attack paths. So should, let's say a public IP of a EC2 account is exposed, right? What are the repercussions or consequences that can happen, and it will grade that severity, right, along with those alerts that go with that. So let's take a look at the rules, right? So we can clearly see that we have a little toggle switch here. It's pretty nice. So I can essentially toggle that as active, inactive, and then the service related to it, right? Now when we're looking at the risk, this essentially will populate, think of this as a category. So as you can see, EC2 AMI is owned by you should not be set to public, right? So let's say I didn't want that, or maybe my organization has a different risk tolerance, right? Things of that nature. Fairly interactive and really straight to the point, right? But again, then it categorizes that. So first you have remember your severity. So I can filter by descending, right? And then I can go to the settings as well, right? And I'll show you what that looks like. Let me see if I can go to, yep, settings right here. And let me go to connected accounts. So when I hit scan account, that essentially will start my scan. If I go to results, that will show you the result. If I go back to there, that will stop that portion. Okay. And then when I go back here, I can essentially start that scan, right? And it'll tell you you're going to trigger that. This will start a scan in process.